In this lecture, we are going to talk about the problem of free will and determinism. Let's first consider the following questions. Have you ever made a decision that was entirely your own? If so, describe it. Take a few seconds to think about this question. Well, apparently, whether to skip a class or not, whether to go to a specific restaurant or not, it seems that we make decisions that was entirely our own in everyday life. So to speak, it seems that it's a common sense that we are free. We have free will. But now, consider the next question. If a person commits a serious crime, but is wholly determined to do so by one's upbringing, for example, by criminal influences or by drugs, should one be held responsible for the crime? That is, if one is forced to commit a serious crime, that is, one had no choice but be forced to commit a crime, would that person be held morally responsible for the crime? Well, I think most of you would reply that in such case, the person is not responsible, is not morally responsible for the crime because the person is forced. The person had no choice, right? So this question indicates that there is a close relationship between free will and moral responsibility. If one had no free will, one would not be morally responsible for one's behavior. That sounds reasonable, right? Now, think about the third question. Is freedom necessary for living the good life in a good society? Can you imagine circumstances in which freedom would be undesirable or at least irrelevant? Now, this question asks about what other roles free will plays in our ordinary life. So think about it. Other than moral responsibility, could free will bring us something else in order to live a good life? Well, maybe it's the sense of agency, the sense of being independent, the sense of being an independent person, right? That kind of elements may be necessary for living the good life in our society. But what is free will? What is the definition of free will? Well, according to a common definition in the literature, one has free will, or one is free, if and only if, when one decides among forks in the road of time, one is at least sometimes able to take more than one of the forks. Okay, so like in this picture, when one decides among forks in the road of time, this is a timeline. Okay, so at this point there's a fork. there are forks at this moment of time. So when one decides among forks, one is at least sometimes. It's not necessary to be able to take more than one of the forks at all times. All right. So what's necessary is just that at least sometimes one is able to take more than one of the forks. That is, one has more than one choice when making a decision. In other words, at least sometimes more than one of the forks in the road of time is open to the person at this point. So this is one possible future. This is another possible future relative to this moment of time, right? So this possible future corresponds to a specific choice one would make. This is another possible future relative to another choice. So in this picture, there are 4 possible futures corresponding 4 possible choices one would make. All right, and each choice, each possible future is equal. That is, all alternative futures are equally possible, equally open to one's decision. Okay, so given that definition, here is the case in which one is not free. One does not have free will, even though it feels like the person has free will. The person is free. So the situation is this. A person, John, is locked in a room and doesn't know the door is locked. And the person is in the process of deliberating about whether to leave. And hence, he thinks he is free to leave. All right, so a person is in a room but doesn't know the door is locked. It's natural for the person to think he has free will. He can freely decide whether to leave or not. Okay, so it feels like for the person that the person is free. But in fact, the person is not free. Because one of the alternative futures the person is thinking about, that is leaving, is not open to the person. So the person lacks free will in the matter of staying or leaving. Okay, so this case is supposed to point out that the issue here is not about whether one feels that one is free. The issue is that whether one is actually free, whether a person is in fact free. Okay, it has nothing to do with how one feels. Here's an experiment that seems to show that free will is an illusion. Do take a few minutes to watch this video. But seriously, is there any reason to think that we are not free at all? Even though it feels like we are free, but in fact we are not free. Is there any reason for that kind of thought? Well, we may think about this question first. What is science about? What is the nature of science? Well, science is about explaining what's going on in the world, making a theory to systematically explain what's going on in the world, and by that theory to make predictions about the future, right? To predict what would happen in the future. But the point of prediction, the essence of prediction, is that given the conditions obtained now, what will happen in the future can be determined. In other words, prediction is possible only when what will happen in the future can be determined given the conditions obtained at the present, right? So to speak, predictions are possible only if determinism is true. And determinism is the view that what would happen in the future is determined by the preconditions at present. More importantly, the success of science seems to depend on whether its prediction is successful, right? The more successful a scientific theory is, if its prediction is more successful. And we heavily rely on this kind of science. We heavily rely on successful predictions. For example, it would be important for all of us whether it will rain tomorrow, whether there will be earthquake tomorrow, and whether global warming would end up with the extinction of human beings, right? And all of that depends on determinism. Without determinism, predictions are not possible. But if this makes sense, but if determinism is true, how can we be free at all? In order to address the problem, let's first define determinism. The precise definition of the determinism in the present context is that at every moment, the total states of the universe determines a unique future. So for example, in this picture, let's consider this moment of time. And this is a timeline, right? A timeline is a structure of everything in the universe from the past to the future, all right? So a point on this timeline is actually a three-dimensional space. That is, a point, this specific point on the timeline, represents the total states of everything in three-dimensional space at this time. Okay, so a point is not only a point actually represents everything in three-dimensional space, including their states. Okay, so consider this moment of time, consider this point. It represents the total states of the universe at this time. And this point determines a unique future. In other words, there are no alternative futures connected to this point, to this moment of time, to this state of the universe. That is, given this total state of the universe at this moment, only one future is physically possible. Others are not. Okay? So it is in this sense the total states of the universe at a moment of time determines a unique future. So only one configuration of the states of the things at a given moment is consistent with the laws of nature, whereas other alternative futures are not consistent with the laws of nature given the preconditions at this moment of time. And what's that? Because it is the laws of the nature that determines what is physically possible, and the laws of nature are deterministic, supposedly. Okay. So what does it mean to say that a law of nature is deterministic? Well, consider Newton's second law of motion, F equals ma. Given certain amount of force exerted on an object with a certain amount of mass, what would happen next is entirely determined, right? What acceleration that this object would have is entirely determined by the force acting upon the object and the mass of the object. If the force acting upon the object, say, is 2 newtons, and the mass is 2 kilograms, then the acceleration it would have would be 1 meter per second squared. So there is no exception according to this Newton's second law of motion. There's just one possible value given the preconditions here. And it is the sense in which this kind of law is deterministic. If all laws of nature is deterministic, then we can say this much. What has happened in the past, what is happening at the present, and what will happen in the future are already determined by the total states of the universe at the moment of the Big Bang. That is to say, the whole evolution of the universe, including its past states, its present states, and its future states, already determined by the states of the Big Bang. If all laws of nature are deterministic. But if determinism is true, the possibility of one or the other of these contemplated futures is mere appearance, an illusion, in fact. And why they seem to us, they're open to us. Well, that's because our knowledge is limited. We have no complete knowledge of the total states of the universe at this point. So it seems to us that these alternative futures are open to us, given the preconditions at this moment of time. But actually, that's just an illusion. That seems to be the case merely because our knowledge is not perfect. So in reality, there's only one true future connected, open to this point, given the preconditions of this moment of time, given the total states of the universe at this moment of time, if determinism is true. But the problem is that, given the definition of free will, if determinism is true, then we are not free at all. Recall that we are free if and only if, at this moment of time, alternative futures are really, genuinely connected, that is, open to this point, right? But if determinism is true, all these alternative futures are not connected to this point. So there's only one future that's connected to this point. There's only one future that's consistent, that is allowed by laws of nature, if these laws are deterministic. Okay, so for that reason, those alternative futures are not connected to the point, and therefore it's just an illusion that these alternative futures seem to be open to us. Well, a quick response to the tension between determinism and free will may be that, well, determinism is about fundamental physics, the fundamental physical world. But free will is about our mental world. It's about human beings. It's not about free will. It's not about fundamental physics, but about human behaviors. What's going on in human minds. But would that response satisfactory? Consider this. What we do in terms of bodily movement is physical. That is, our behaviors is, after all, just physical movements. And what And what we are made of is chemical. That is, we are made of fundamental particles. And both are to be governed by the laws of nature, which are deterministic. Assuming that all laws of nature are deterministic. Okay. So, you think you are making a choice, but it may be that, in reality, causes now at work in your brain and central nervous system and the immediate environment have already ruled out the other alternative futures. That is, given the states of your brain, your central nervous system, and the immediate environment, there's only one possible future consistent with these preconditions. Okay? Only that you don't have complete knowledge about these preconditions, so it seems that you are still free, you can still make more than one choices. Other alternative futures are open to you. But after all, it's just an illusion. Just like, the person locked in the room. It seems to the person that the person is free from the person's perspective. But in fact, the person is not free. Hence, free will is an illusion if determinism is true, just as the person being locked in a room and doesn't know the door is locked is in fact not free to leave, although the person thinks he is free to leave. Alright, so this is a very nice video summarizing the points explained above. So do take a look at this video. Okay, so let me do a quick summary. The issues here are as follows. The first one is the world deterministic? Are all laws of nature deterministic? Is determinism true? That's the first issue. Okay. Now the second issue is that, do we have free will? Are we in fact free? Can we make free choices? Are there alternative futures open to us at some moment of time? Now, apparently, the two issues are connected according to my explanation. If determinism is true, then we are not free. But that connection is itself controversial. Okay, although it seems that it's a fact that the two, determinism and free will, are not compatible with each other. But actually, that's a controversial theory. That's a controversial position. And like I mentioned in the first slide or the second slide, whether we are free is closely related to another issue concerning our moral responsibility. Okay, if we are not free, if we don't have free will, then we don't have moral responsibility. according to, at least a lot of us. Now, according to Peter von Inwagen, a great metaphysician, free will and determinism are not compatible with each other. Such position is called incompatibilism. All right. So, but still, within this camp, we can further have two different views. One is that determinism is true, so we are not free. The other is that we are free, and so determinism is false. Okay? Since determinism and free will are not compatible with each other, so we may pick any one of the two. Whether we can either pick we can either pick determinism or free will. And Peter von Inwagen takes the position that's called libertarianism, according to which we do have free will, and therefore determinism is false. Okay? According to such view, according to libertarianism, our decisions are undetermined, and therefore determinism is false. If Peter von Inwagen's view is a kind of incompatibilism, so there must be the rival position called compatibilism, right? According to compatibilism, determinism is compatible with free will, the existence of free will. Okay, how is that possible? But anyway, according to compatibilism, although the future is determined, alternative futures are nevertheless open to some people. Okay, so it's interesting. According to determinism, the future universe, the future states of the universe is determined by the preconditions happening now. But we are still free. But alternative futures are somehow open to us. Okay? Sounds weird, but that's the view. Apparently, John's case, the case of a person locked in a room, it's not a good case. Okay, not knowing the door is locked, leaving the room is not open to the person. That's a sure thing. So, in order to make sense of compatibilism, we need to come up with a better case, which is this one. Okay, another person, say Peter, now writing nonstop, doing so for example, the person Peter is doing his final paper. Okay, and Peter is doing this because the deadline of the final paper is approaching, and Peter's personality is such that he never misses the deadline. Okay, so given Peter's personality and Peter's goal of meeting the deadline of the final paper, it is determined that Peter is writing nonstop, okay, say at midnight. However, for Peter to stop writing and do a little dance is still open to Peter, according to our intuition, right? Even though, Peter is determined to write his final paper at midnight, nonstop. If Peter were to stop writing, Peter would make a different choice, right? So although a choice on Peter's part would be effective if that choice occurred, it is still, as a matter of fact, not going to occur, and therefore, given determinism, it is determined by the present state of things and the laws of nature that such a choice is not going to occur. In other words, the choice to stop writing and do a little dance is in fact not going to occur, given determinism, given the preconditions here. But that choice, the choice to stop writing and do a little dance, could have occurred. Okay, so there's a difference between actuality and possibility. There is a difference between what is actually going on and what could happen counterfactually. Okay? Simply put, it's a matter of fact that Peter does not want to stop writing. But Peter could have wanted to stop writing. Although Peter does not want to stop writing, but Peter could have wanted to stop writing. After all, Peter is not forced to do anything, right? Peter is not like John, being locked in a room. Peter is not coerced. Peter is not forced by anything else. So it's entirely up to Peter whether to stop writing or not. The thing is simply that Peter wants to keep writing rather than stop writing. But Peter could have wanted to stop writing. It's entirely up to Peter, okay? So the fact that Peter wants to keep writing is determined by the preconditions, and therefore determinism is true. But since Peter could have wanted to stop writing, and that choice could be effective, Peter is free. Peter still has free will. Okay, so in this case, free will and compatibilism. Sorry about that. So in this case, determinism and the existence of free will are compatible with each other. And is there any reason for such kind of view? Do we have any motivation for positions like compatibilism? Well, an apparent reason, an easy reason is this, is a moral one, okay? So, for example, we do modify our behavior by rewarding behavior we like and punishing behaviors we dislike. We tell people that we will put them in jail if they steal and that they will get a tax break if they invest their money in such a way. But there is no point in trying to get people to act in a certain way if that way is not in some sense open to them. There is no point in telling a person that he will go to jail if he steals unless it is somehow open to him not to steal. That is, it's a fact that we do modify behavior of people. And that practice already assumes that people are free. Otherwise, there will be no point in trying this. But on the other hand, determinism is true. So a natural strategy is to hold a compatibilist position. On the one hand, determinism is true. On the other, we are free. Yeah, this is what I said. We can hold two fundamental beliefs all at once. Okay, one is free will for morality, the other is determinism for science. Now, Peter van Wagen does not like this position. Van Wagen offers an argument against compatibilism. So this is an argument based on this concept, the concept of an untouchable fact. Okay, what is that? Well, let's say y, something y, some fact y is an untouchable fact for another fact x. If and only if one can do anything about y, it never could have, no matter what knowledge x might have had, and no matter how lucky x might have been. Okay, sorry about the explanation of this. This is the x. The letter x stands for a person, an agent, and y is a fact, and it's an untouchable fact for the agent x if the agent cannot do anything about y, no matter what. Okay, so an example of an untouchable fact would be the fact that the Earth is round. None of us can do anything about it, right? The Earth is round. And why is that? Because this fact is determined by the preconditions at the moment of time when the solar system develops, and that time is far beyond our birth, so we cannot do anything about the fact that the Earth is round. So in this case, the fact that the Earth is round is an untouchable fact for us. Okay, now Van Wagen offers the principle concerning untouchable facts. It goes like this. If premise 1, It is an untouchable fact that P. It is an untouchable fact that if P then Q, then it follows that it is an untouchable fact that Q. So, although it looks like an argument, this is the first premise, the second premise, and it's the conclusion. Okay. The first premise is that the fact that P is untouchable. The fact that a conditional fact that if P then Q is another untouchable fact, then we can conclude that the fact that Q is also untouchable. But actually, this is a complicated conditional. Okay, since it's a principle, it's a conditional, consists of the first part, the second part as its an antecedent, and the third part as its consequent. So basically, it's the conditional that says that if P is untouchable, and if P then Q is another untouchable fact, then Q is also an untouchable fact. Okay, so it's pretty complex. Now, an example of this principle would be this. Let's make P stands for this proposition. Okay, the last dinosaur died long before I was born. This is the fact that P. And Q stands for the fact that I have never seen a living dinosaur. Okay, so it seems right that if P is true, then Q is true. Sounds right. If the last dinosaur died long before I was born, then I have never seen a living dinosaur. That's for sure. So if P then Q, this conditional holds, and it seems reasonable that if P then Q is untouchable, is an untouchable fact, right? We cannot do anything about the last dinosaur died long before I was born, since that's an event occurred before our birth. We have no control over their death. So this fact is untouchable for us. And this conditional, if this, then that, is also untouchable. We cannot do anything about this conditional. If this happens, then that happens. We have no control over that. We cannot change that at all. Okay. So, given the principle, it seems right to say that I have never seen a living dinosaur is another untouchable fact. We cannot do anything about it, right? If this is untouchable, if this conditional, if this then that is untouchable, then of course the consequent is also untouchable. We cannot do anything about it. We cannot change that. We cannot change the fact that we have never seen a living dinosaur. Okay, so that's the principle. Again, it's the principle that if P is untouchable, if P then Q as a whole is untouchable, then Q is untouchable. Now, the principle the notion of untouchable facts and the principle concerning untouchable facts can be used to construct an argument against compatibilism. What's that? Well, recall the principle. P is untouchable. If P then Q is untouchable, then Q is untouchable. Now, we replace P with this proposition. Things were this and so 10 million years ago. Okay, this is a fact. The fact that P, okay, that is P is the fact that things were this and so 10 million years ago. And apparently, it's an untouchable fact for us. We cannot do anything about this fact. Now, given determinism, this conditional is also untouchable. Given determinism, if things were this and so 10 million years ago, then Peter is now writing the book. Peter is now writing the final paper, given determinism, right? And there is no exception. Given determinism, this is already determined by this precondition. We cannot change that since determinism is true. So this conditional is also untouchable. And given the principle concerning untouchable facts, what can we conclude? Well, Peter is now writing the final paper. This fact is also untouchable for us, for Peter. Okay, Peter cannot do anything about that. And therefore, the choice to stop writing and do a little dance is not open to Peter. In reality, given that this is untouchable, given that determinism is true, and given the principle, okay? And why alternative futures, other alternative futures, why other alternative choices are not open to Peter? Because Peter cannot do anything about this. There's no way at all to change this fact. There's no possibility of changing this fact. Okay, and therefore, other alternative choices are not open to Peter. Well, given this argument against compatibilism, here are some possible responses. Well, we can admit that, well, there's no free will, right? Since determinism is true. Or, well, we may say determinism is false and therefore we have free will. Or the third option is to reject the principle, okay? The principle concerning untouchable facts. And von Wagen's compatible solution would be to pick the second option. Okay, the universe is not determined, that is, determinism is false. And the option 3 is not recommended by von Wagen. Okay. And compatibilist solution, compatibilist position, that is, according to which free will is true, free will exists, and determinism is true, amounts to pick option 3, right? That is, the principle is false, and so one is free, even though one is determined by preconditions, even though one cannot do anything about what has happened in the past, even if determinism is true, but since the principle is false, we cannot infer that, for example, Peter cannot do anything about keeping writing, right? So no matter how appealing the principle is, the principle is just false. It is like, Euclidean geometry is so intuitive, is so appealing, but it has proved that Euclidean geometry is false, in a sense, at least in relativistic physics. So no matter how the principle concerning untouchable facts is appealing, it is after all false according to compatibilism. But according to Feigenbaum, this is not a recommended solution because it would be a great mystery if the principle is false. So the relatively reasonable option is to say determinism is false. That is, to hold the position called indeterminism. And this kind of position is backed up by quantum physics. Why? Because major interpretations of quantum mechanics are right, and the universe is indeterministic. That is, according to successful major interpretations of quantum mechanics, the fundamental physical law of the universe is indeterministic. They are probabilistic. Here is one example. So a particle like an electron can be in a special state called the superpositional state. It could be in a superposition of spin up and spin down. Okay, so it's a very special, peculiar state. So that if you measure whether it's actually spinning up or spinning down, you get a probabilistic result. Okay, it's entirely probabilistic. There's no way to determine, to decide, to predict which one would happen with 100% precision. It's just not possible to predict which one is actually the case. It's entirely probabilistic. Okay, if we measure an electron in such state, we would end up with 50% chance of observing this result and 50% of chance of observing this result. Okay, it's completely probabilistic. So nothing in the universe at this moment of time can determine which one of the futures would be occurring. Okay, that is, there are two possible futures. this or that. There are two possible alternative futures that are physically consistent with quantum physics and the preconditions, the total states of the universe at this moment of time. Okay, so according to the definition of determinism, such case is a case for indeterminism. It's a counter example to determinism. Okay. Well, is that the end of story? No. Because, indeterminism may endanger free will equally. Why is that? Now consider this. At the fork, in the case of Peter, whether to keep writing or stop writing and do a little dance is completely undetermined. Okay, which choice to make is completely undetermined at this point. At the fork, Peter's mental states are neutral to either choice, and no prediction is possible. Otherwise, determinism is true, right? So, according to the quantum, the example of quantum mechanics just mentioned, whether this or that is going to occur is entirely probabilistic with equal chains. Okay? Suppose it just so happens randomly that the decision goes one way. Now, ask yourself this question. Is it really up to Peter which way to go? Whether this or that is going to occur is entirely a matter of random. It's entirely a random matter. They have equal chains of taking place. It's really up to Peter to make a choice, to decide which way to go. Well, I think most of you will respond that in such case, it's not really up to Peter to decide which way to go, right? Since it's just like a toss of coin. It's entirely a chancy event. It's entirely a matter of probability, whether to write or to dance. Therefore, randomness destroys free will to bring about something. Hence, there is no free will if determinism is true either. So, so what's going on? If determinism is true, we are not free. But if indeterminism is true, it's doubtful that we are free at all. So either way, we don't seem to have free will. So is free will impossible self-contradictory notion in the end? So you may ask yourself this question. Do you really think it isn't up to you which of the courses of action you will choose, to study or to play? can you really believe that you are not free? In spite of the controversies surrounding determinism or indeterminism. Just think about whether you're free intuitively. It's hard to believe that we're not free, right? It's irresistible to believe that alternative futures are open to us. This tendency may be a vehicle of illusion, but that doesn't matter, according to Vangenwagen. Why? Because, well, given that determinism and indeterminism equally endanger the existence of free will, it may be a mystery to believe in the existence of free will. Okay? But according to Vangenwagen, this mystery is worthy. Why? Because we believe that the outcome of our deliberations about what to do is undetermined. We do believe that. Okay? And secondly, we believe that it is sometimes up to us what the outcome of these deliberations will be. So to speak. Simply put, Vangenwagen's idea is that the consequence of believing in the existence of free will is good. Such belief can bring us a lot of benefits. Like if we believe in the existence of free will, then we can give a very good explanation of our moral responsibilities and the existence of our agency, independency, and so on and so forth. So that's the point of metaphysics. Right? We will have to evaluate pros and cons of taking a position. Yeah, the existence of free will may be a mystery, given that indeterminism or determinism equally endangers free will. But the advantage of believing in free will is so huge that can counter its disadvantage. That's Vangenwagen's idea. Now let's consider a different approach offered by Harry Frankfurt. According to this approach, free will and determinism are compatible with each other. And what grounds incompatibilism is the principle of alternative possibilities, according to Frankfurt's analysis. But the principle of alternative possibilities, according to Frankfurt, is false, and therefore morality or free will is compatible with determinism. Okay, that's the basic position. Now, what's Frankfurt's argument for that? Well, let's first consider the principle of alternative possibilities. It's a principle supporting incompatibilism. Okay, so the principle is the idea that a person is morally responsible for what the person has done only if the person could have done otherwise. Okay, that's pretty In a way, it's pretty intuitive. Just consider whether a person is morally responsible for the crime the person commits. If the person is forced to do so or coerced to do so, that is, if the person couldn't have done otherwise, since the person is coerced or forced to do so, then the person is not morally responsible for the crime the person commits. Pretty intuitive, right? And therefore, according to this principle, moral responsibility and determinism are incompatible, because if determinism is true, the person, anyone, no one could have done otherwise, right? Everyone has to do what the person has done. So a person who has been coerced, controlled to do something did not do it freely, and is not morally responsible for having done it according to the principle. So being coerced, being controlled, being forced deprives a person of freedom and moral responsibility at once. Put it in a different way, once having been unable to do otherwise entails one's lack of moral responsibility as well as free will. Okay. So again, if one couldn't have done otherwise, given that one has done something and one couldn't have done otherwise, no alternative futures is open, is connected, is open to this person, right? Since the person couldn't have done otherwise other than what the person has actually done. So no alternative future, no possible futures, no other possible futures are open to the person. And that satisfies the definition of determinism. Okay. If that's the case, given the principle, the person is not morally responsible for whatever the person has done. Okay. And if a person has no moral responsibility for what the person has done, the person, basically that's because the person does not have free will. So this principle is basically the principle supporting incompatibilism. If determinism is true, then one is not free. Okay, if one is free, then determinism is false. We could have done otherwise. We could have done things other than we have done. We actually did. Okay. Okay. So, but according to Frankfurt, that principle is false, because the following three scenarios. The first scenario, let's consider the first scenario, called Jones 1. Okay. Jones 1 is a person. Jones 1 is the person who does what he has once decided to do, no matter what happens next, and no matter what the cost. Okay. So to speak, once the person has decided to do something, the person will not be changed. Nothing can change that person. Now, unless the person is mind controlled by something else, by someone else. That's Jones 1. Now the thing is, Jones 1 has made the decision to kill another innocent guy. But at some point, Jones 1 is mind controlled by Professor X, by someone like Professor X, and it's a coincidence that Professor X also wants the guy to open the fire, to kill the innocent guy. So the coercion, the mind control, actually had no effective force on Jones 1. Why is that? Because were Jones 1 not controlled, Jones 1 would still have fired the gun, right? So it's just a coincidence that Professor X and Jones 1 both want to kill another innocent person. But Professor X's coercion, mind control, actually had no effective force on Jones 1. If we think about the scenario counterfactually, were Jones 1 not existing, were Jones 1 not controlled, sorry about that, were Professor X not existing, were Professor X not wanting this, or were Jones 1 not controlled, Jones 1 would still have killed the person. Okay? Now, think about this question. Given these assumptions, is Jones 1 morally wrong? Is Jones 1 morally responsible for killing an innocent person? Well, the thing is that Jones 1, given that Jones 1 is mind controlled by Professor X, Jones 1 couldn't have done otherwise, right? Jones 1 must kill the innocent person anyway. Jones 1 couldn't have done otherwise, given the mind control of Professor X. So according to the principle of alternative possibilities, Jones 1 does not seem to be morally responsible for killing the innocent person. But according to our intuition, since Jones 1 is the person of this kind of personality, were Jones 1 not controlled, Jones 1 would still have killed the innocent person. And therefore, there is a sense in which Jones 1 is still morally responsible for what he has done, right? Were there no mind control, Jones 1 would still have killed the person. That's Frankfurt's idea. So that is, the coercion control in no way reduces the moral responsibility of Jones 1. In order to strengthen this point, let's consider Jones 2. Now, Jones 2, another person, Jones 2, in many ways like Jones 1. Okay, just that the person does not want to kill any innocent people. Okay. So, however, Jones 2 is mind controlled by Professor X. So given the coercion control, Jones 2 would have performed the action of killing the innocent person regardless of what decision he had already made. So in this case, Jones 2's earlier decision played no role in bringing it about that he did what he did. Okay. So in this case, is Jones 2 morally responsible for killing the innocent person? Again, Jones 2 does not want to kill the innocent person. Jones 2 does not want to hurt any innocent people. Okay. And he actually killed the innocent person because of Professor X, because Professor X wants him to do so. So Professor X mind control overrides Jones 2's intention to do no harm. So in this case, there is a sense in which Jones 2 should not be held morally responsible for killing the innocent person, right? And like Jones 1, Jones 2 couldn't have done otherwise. Why? Because Jones 2 is mind controlled by Professor X. So what Jones 2 actually does is determined by Professor X mind control. So in this case, determinism is still true. Jones 2 is determined to kill the innocent person. But why is there a sense in which Jones 2 is not morally responsible for killing the innocent person? Because were Jones 2 not controlled, he wouldn't have killed the guy, right? Were Professor X not existing, were Professor X not wanting Jones 2 to fire the gun, were Jones 2 not controlled, Jones 2 wouldn't have killed the innocent guy. So in this case, according to Frankfurt, Jones 2 shouldn't be held morally responsible for killing the innocent guy. That is, the coercion, the mind control in this case, does reduce the moral responsibility of Jones 1. Because Jones 2. Because Jones 2 had a different intention, the intention to do no harm. It's Professor X command that overrides this good intention, Jones 2's intention. So Jones 2, since Jones 2's earlier intention is not to hurt anyone, killing the death of the innocent guy should not be on Jones 2. The moral responsibility for the innocent guy's death should be on Professor X. Now, here is another similar scenario, Jones 3. Only that Jones 3, though having doubts, Jones 3 performed the action motivated solely by Jones 3's earlier decision. Okay. The coercion control plays little role in Jones 3's reasoning. Were Jones 3 not controlled, Jones 3 might still have killed the innocent guy. So in this case, is Jones 3 morally wrong? Well, according to Frankfurt, Jones 3 is similar to Jones 1. In this scenario, we tend to find Jones 3 still morally responsible for the death of the innocent person. So what can we conclude? In all of the three scenarios, determinism is true. Neither Jones 1 or Jones 2 or Jones 3 could have done otherwise, right? Since they are all controlled by Professor X. As a matter of fact, they couldn't have done otherwise. They're determined to kill the innocent guy. But there's a difference in their moral responsibilities, right? At least in some sense. So what explains their difference in their moral responsibilities? Apparently, the difference relies on their earlier intentions, right? It's really their earlier intentions that determines their moral responsibilities. And so, even though determinism is true, people can still have moral responsibility depending on their intentions. And why is that? Because coercion control affects a person's moral status only when the person acts as he does because the person is coerced to do so. That is, when the coercion is what accounts for the person's action. The fact that the person could not have avoided doing something is a sufficient condition for what the person did. Like 3 Jones are determined to fire the gun, but this fact may play no role in the explanation of why the person did it. That is, 3 Jones have different reasons, motivations, intentions. Okay. Therefore, we can still have free will and moral responsibilities. Again, determinism is about what we actually do. But determinism cannot explain why we actually do something. Alright? Determinism can at most explain what we actually do, what behaviors we actually take. But determinism cannot explain our motivations, our reason, our intentions. It is our intentions, reasons, motivations that explain why we take one behavior rather than another. Okay? And therefore, we can still have free will and moral responsibilities given the considerations of the three scenarios. So the fact that we couldn't have done otherwise clearly provides no basis for supposing that we might have done otherwise if we had been able to do so. Okay. That is, according to Frankfurt, there's a distinction between what we could have done and what we might have done. Determinism is about what we could have done and what we couldn't have done. But that provides no basis of what we might have done if we were able to do something different. Okay. And since what we could have done, what we couldn't have done cannot explain what we might have done. And what we might have done provides basis for free will and moral responsibility. Therefore, we can infer that free will and moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. You get the idea? Okay, so that's Frankfurt's position, Frankfurt's approach to the problem of free will and determinism. Here's the discussion topic for the week. Suppose that the world is deterministic, and hence whatever we do is determined by the total states of the universe up to the present moment. In this case, do you think we still have free will in any sense? If we do, can Frankfurt's theory help explain this? If we don't, how can von Wagen's theory help explain this? Know that you don't need to answer both questions. Just pick one position, okay? And yeah, just pick one of A and B.